I want to start with a number. Not a theory, not a claim, just a number, 4 billion. That's how many trees died in the span of a single human lifetime. Not across geological time, not through the slow pressure of climate shift or the creeping advance of desert. In 40 years, one species across one continent, in 4 decades, gone. And if you grew up in North America and attended school at any point in the last century, there's a reasonable chance you've never heard of it. That silence is where this story actually begins. The American chestnut, Castanea dentata. Before 1904, it was not a remarkable tree in the way that rarity makes things remarkable. It was everywhere. It grew from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic coast deep into the Ohio Valley. It made up, by some estimates, roughly a quarter of all trees in the eastern deciduous forest. A quarter. Walk through any woodland between the Appalachians and the sea in 1890, and you were, almost by definition, walking through a chestnut forest. And it fed people, not incidentally, not as a supplement. It fed people the way a staple crop feeds people, reliably, abundantly, annually, without anyone planting a single seed or tending a single branch. Every autumn, across an area that covered what is now several of the most densely populated states in the country, the chestnuts fell. Millions of tons, freely available, requiring nothing. Indigenous peoples had built substantial portions of their food economy around this tree for thousands of years. Rural Appalachian communities in the 1800s relied on chestnut mast for a significant percentage of annual caloric intake. Hogs were fattened on it. Children ate them roasted on city streets. The nuts could be dried, ground into flour, stored for winter. A family with access to a few mature chestnut trees and the knowledge to use them was, in a meaningful sense, partially insulated from the market economy, from having to buy, from having to sell labor to buy the thing that kept them alive. That matters. Remember that. In 1904, a fungal pathogen was identified on chestnut trees at the Bronx Zoo. The record describes it as having arrived via a shipment of Asian chestnut trees imported for ornamental planting. Cryphonectria parasitica, a fungus that kills the above-ground portion of a chestnut tree by girdling the bark, cutting off the flow of nutrients, producing a canker that spreads along the cambium until the tree dies above the infection point. The roots survive. That's an important detail. The roots of infected American chestnuts survive. They continue to produce sprouts. The sprouts grow, sometimes reaching considerable size before being reinfected, killed back again, the cycle repeating. The tree isn't dead in the way a felled tree is dead. It's trapped. It reaches for the light, gets killed back, reaches again, gets killed back again. A living system endlessly interrupted before it can fruit. By 1940, approximately 4 billion American chestnut trees had been killed by this pathogen. 4 billion. The largest single die-off of any tree species in recorded history. Faster than Dutch elm disease, faster than any other forest pathogen we have documented. An entire keystone species, a quarter of an entire forest ecosystem, eliminated in 4 decades. The official explanation is accident, a single infected batch of trees, an introduced pathogen meeting a naive host population. Tragedy, but the kind of tragedy that happens. Biology is indifferent. And maybe that's all it is. I want to be honest about that. I'm not in a position to prove otherwise, but here's what I keep returning to. Not the death itself, the timing. The American chestnut began dying in 1904. The die-off was essentially complete by the early 1950s. In 1905, the US Department of Agriculture formalized the structure that would become the modern agricultural extension system, embedding a particular model of food production into rural American life at an institutional level. In 1916, the Federal Farm Loan Act created mechanisms for tying small farmers to credit markets in ways that previous generations had not been. In the 1920s and 1930s, the industrialization of food processing and the early consolidation of what we now call agribusiness began in earnest. In 1944, the Rockefeller Foundation launched what would become the Green Revolution, a project that over the following decades systematically replaced locally adapted, locally owned food systems with high-yield varieties that required purchased inputs, purchased seeds, purchased chemical support. I am not drawing a direct line between these events. I want to be explicit about that because the moment you draw a direct line, you stop being able to think clearly about what you're actually looking at. But look at the sequence. A species that provided free, abundant, decentralized calories to every person in its range dies at exactly the historical moment when centralized food production is beginning to consolidate. At the exact moment when the architecture of food dependency is being laid down, institution by institution, policy by policy, loan mechanism by loan mechanism, the chestnut dies and is replaced not by another free tree but by a system that requires participation, a system from which exit is not free. This raises a simple but critical question. If the goal of agricultural modernization was to feed more people more reliably, why did no institution, no government program, no philanthropic foundation, no university extension office in the century following the chestnut blight make any serious effort to replant an equivalent free food system in its place? Why was the chestnut's role not considered a problem that needed solving? Let me be precise about what the chestnut actually was, because I think the modern imagination has difficulty holding the concept. A mature American chestnut tree begins producing meaningful quantities of nuts after roughly 15 to 20 years. At full production, a single large chestnut tree can produce in excess of 2,000 nuts in a single season. The nuts are high in carbohydrates, significant in protein, low in fat compared to other tree nuts, and unlike acorns, require no processing to be edible. You can eat them raw, directly from the ground. A grove of mature chestnut trees, which is how they historically existed, because chestnut forests in the Appalachians were essentially continuous, produce quantities of food that no agricultural plot of equivalent size could match, without machinery, without irrigation, without chemical inputs, without labor, without infrastructure, without anything except the trees being there and the season arriving. This is not a fringe assessment. Ecological historians who study pre-industrial food systems have written carefully and at length about the caloric and nutritional contribution of chestnut mass to both indigenous and settler populations in the eastern United States. This is not contested. What is interesting is how little this knowledge has circulated into the general public understanding of what was lost in 1904. Go find a school textbook that covers the chestnut blight. If you can find one that mentions it at all, note how it frames the loss. Note whether it frames it as an economic loss, as a loss of lumber, as an ecological disruption. Note whether it frames it as the elimination of a food system that a significant portion of the American population had relied on without payment or permission for hundreds of years. Note the silence. The chestnut story has a shape that once you recognize it, you begin to find it elsewhere. There is a species called the Mongongo newt, Shinziophyton rautaneni. It grows across large areas of the Kalahari and the broader southern African woodland belt. The Sparnt Kungsan, whom anthropologists in the 1960s studied as a kind of living window into pre-agricultural subsistence, relied on the Mongongo nut as a dietary staple. A single tree in full production can produce roughly 2 kilograms of nutritious nuts per day through the main harvest season. The nuts are high in protein and vitamin E. They fall to the ground and can be collected from the soil. They require nothing. When researchers asked the Pant Kung why they hadn't adopted agriculture, one elder's answer, translated and widely quoted in the anthropological literature, was something to the effect of, "Why would we plant things when there are so many Mongongo nuts in the world?" That response has been treated for 50 years as evidence of primitive reasoning, as an inability to conceive of food security beyond immediate abundance, as proof that hunter-gatherer peoples lived at the mercy of nature without the foresight to cultivate. This interpretation collapses when you look at what was actually there. The Mongongo forests of the Kalahari are not randomly distributed. They appear in patterns that ethnobotanists, when pressed, will quietly acknowledge don't match natural dispersal models for the species. They cluster, they concentrate near old habitation sites, they exist in densities that ecological models of seed dispersal and germination don't fully explain. Whether those forests were managed, planted, intentionally shaped over many human generations, or simply maintained and extended by populations who understood what they had, is a question that mainstream anthropology has not pursued with the energy it deserves. What's interesting is what happened after contact, after displacement, after the introduction of land tenure systems and cash economies and the criminalization of nomadic land use. The communities that had maintained those forest relationships were moved, settled, registered, incorporated into dependency economies. The forests didn't get cleared the way the American chestnut forests got cleared. They just stopped being used. The knowledge of how to use them, which trees were mature, which groves were in cycle, which combinations of species produced the most complete nutrition. That knowledge is now fragmentary, held by a diminishing number of elders. The trees are still there. The people who understood them as a food system are largely no longer in relationship with them. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed in this context and should. The economics of the replacement. When a free perennial food source is eliminated, whether by blight, by clearing, by displacement of the people who maintained it, the elimination does not leave a vacuum. It leaves a market. The calories that the American chestnut once provided for free had to come from somewhere after 1950. They came from the industrial food system. They were purchased. The carbohydrates that rural Appalachian families once gathered from the forest floor for nothing were now purchased as flour from consolidated grain operations. The protein and fat that indigenous communities once harvested from specific forest ecosystems were replaced by commodity markets that required cash, which required wage labor, which required integration into an economic system that had previously been optional. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming that the chestnut blight was engineered to create this market. I am not claiming that anyone designed the displacement of Mongongo forest knowledge to produce dependent consumers. I genuinely don't know whether either of those things is true, and I'm not going to tell you they are. What I'm claiming, and what the record clearly supports, is that the elimination of free food systems and the expansion of purchased food markets were not unconnected events. One followed the other with a consistency that spans geographies and centuries. And the institutions that most benefited from the expansion of purchased food markets were, in case after case, either directly involved in the policy decisions that produced the eliminations, or were conspicuously silent in their absence from the response. Who mounted a serious effort to replant 4 billion chestnut trees? No one. Who funded research into re-establishing Mongongo forest relationships with displaced southern African communities? Almost no one. Who took the knowledge of indigenous food forest management in the Pacific Northwest and institutionalized it, funded it, taught it in agricultural schools alongside the chemistry of fertilizer? The answer is not no one, but it's very close to no one, and it stayed very close to no one for a very long time. This raises a simple but critical question. What does it mean when the loss of a free food system generates no institutional response aimed at replacement, but generates an enormous institutional response aimed at building the infrastructure for its purchased equivalent? There's a thread I've been pulling on for some time now that leads to an uncomfortable place. Let me walk you through it. In the decade immediately following the identification of the chestnut blight, the United States and several European countries began dramatically expanding their botanical research infrastructure. New experiment stations, new university programs in agricultural science, new foundations dedicated to food security. The language of all of these initiatives was the language of abundance, feeding the world, improving yields, modern agriculture for modern humanity. Not one of these initiatives, in the records I have examined, had as a primary goal the restoration or expansion of free perennial food systems. Not one directed significant resources toward re-establishing the kind of no input, no labour, no purchase food security that the chestnut had represented. They were building something. But what they were building was a more sophisticated version of the system that required participation. That required seeds to be purchased, inputs to be sourced, land to be rented or mortgaged, credit to be extended, and behind the credit, always the necessity of selling something to someone in order to eat. The thing about a chestnut tree is that it doesn't care about your credit. It doesn't require your participation in any market. It doesn't know or care whether you have money or land title or a bank account or a relationship with any institution. It simply produces, every autumn, for centuries if you let it, for anyone within reach. That quality, that magnificent indifference to economic systems is precisely what made it, and systems like it, inconvenient. I'm not telling you what to conclude from that, I'm just describing what the record shows. Let me tell you something that doesn't appear in most histories of the chestnut blight, but that I think you should know. The American chestnut is not extinct, the roots survive. Across the original range of the species, in forests from Georgia to Maine, chestnut root systems that have been underground for over a century continue to send up sprouts. They grow, sometimes reaching 10 or 15 feet, before the blight finds them and kills them back. They come up again. They keep trying. There are researchers working largely outside major institutional funding who have spent decades attempting to develop blight-resistant chestnut strains through back-cross breeding, combining the resistance of Asian chestnut species with the growth and nut characteristics of the American species. It's slow work. It takes decades per breeding cycle because the trees themselves take decades to mature enough to evaluate. The American Chestnut Foundation has been doing this work since 1983, 40 years, with limited funding, without the institutional weight of the USDA behind it, without the philanthropic attention that goes to other agricultural priorities. What they're attempting, essentially, is to restore what was lost, to put back, across the eastern forest, a species that once provided free food to millions of people and could do so again if given the time to mature. The trees they're developing exist. They've been planted in test sites across the original range. Some of them are approaching the age at which they'll begin to fruit. If they work, and there's reason to think they will, you are alive at the moment when a free perennial food system begins haltingly to return to a landscape that was stripped of it 120 years ago. Whether anyone with institutional power will help that return along is the question I keep returning to. Here's where I want to leave you. The official story of the chestnut blight is a story about a tragic accident, a pathogen that moved faster than science could respond, a loss that was mourned and then absorbed into the general forward motion of agricultural progress. The story I've been describing is something different. It's a story about a system of food production that required nothing from you, that owed nothing to any institution, that could be inherited simply by being born in a place where the trees were, and that died in the same historical window when the infrastructure of food dependency was being built around it. I cannot prove those two things are connected. I want to be honest about that. But I can describe the correlation. I can point to the timing. I can note the institutional silence that followed the loss. I can observe that the organizations best positioned to restore something like what was lost have worked for decades in relative obscurity, while the organizations that benefited from the replacement system have operated with resources that make that obscurity look like a choice. Somewhere in the eastern forests of North America, right now, a chestnut sprout is pushing up through the leaf litter. It came from a root that has been underground since before your grandparents were born. It doesn't know about the blight. It doesn't know about the commodity markets or the farm bills or the consolidation of agricultural infrastructure that happened while the root waited. It's just doing what the tree has always done. Reaching. The question isn't whether what was lost could be restored. The question is who gets to decide whether it is, and whether the answer to that question has already been made for you. I'll be here looking.